The skull is complicated if you don't approach it one thing at a time. So let's just start with the big, flat bones of the skull. These are all named for the parts of the brain they overlie. So tap your forehead. This is the frontal bone. All right, that one's easy. The parietal bones cover the top of the brain. You can only see the right parietal bone in this view, but there is a left and a right, and they're sutured together on the midline. At the posterior of the skull is the occipital bone. It is not only at the back, but it's also underneath the skull too. In fact, your spine connects with your brain through a hole in the occipital bone called the spine hole. I'm kidding, it's not called the spine hole. The temporal bone will be very important to us. It just has a lot of features on it that we will identify, like the ear hole here. Again, kidding. It's not the ear hole. The last bone, it's not really a flat bone, but I want to point it out. This bone extends from side to side through the middle of the skull and is called the sphenoid bone. We will identify many features on this bone when we open up the skull and take a look. These big flat bones, these are the bones of the skull that you can easily see from a superficial view. This is, again, an inferior view of the skull. So we're looking from the bottom. We see the occipital bone in brown and the temporal bone in orange. I don't know if you remember the sphenoid bone. We defined it on the very first slide when we did the general bones of the skull. The sphenoid bone fits with the temporal, frontal, and parietal bones. Touch the side of your eye socket and find the rim of your socket. Move back just a little bit, and that's the sphenoid bone. You might be saying to me, those are my temples. That's the temporal bone. Yeah, I know. The sphenoid bone is just a very, very small sliver of a connection on the lateral side of the skull. Look at the sphenoid bone in pink on the picture on the right. It seems to be pretty large on the bottom of the skull. Yeah, it is. Let's look at how the other two bones on this slide that are new. We have the vomer and the palatine bones. I don't know, just know them. No, I just don't have a way to remember the vomer. In fact, it's the one bone that I always forget. But the palatine bone makes you think of your palate. And yes, this is the bone that underlies the upper palate of your mouth. It never ends, right? The skull has so many features. This is the last view of the skull that we consider. When you study the skull, a good way to study is to go through the views and name the bones. Not really think about knowing the bone, but understanding each view. This picture here is a superior view with the parietal bones cut away at the top. Look at the picture on the left to get a sense of what you're seeing. So this is like removing the brain and looking top down. So my mom had many brain surgeries in the 1980s. And back then, they basically did this. She had a scar beginning at her temples and circling her head. I mean, can you imagine healing from a surgery that basically lifts your brain up and out? All right, where do we start on a picture like this? Let's just work from anterior to posterior. We know the frontal bone is the forehead bone, and the ethmoid bone is new to us. It seems to articulate with the frontal bone, like it's nestled in the frontal bone. It is. The ethmoid bone can be associated with the really complicated structures of the nasal cavity. Your nasal cavity is a lot bigger than the canals that lead to it. It's complicated cavern of bone and fleshy folds, and the ethmoid bone creates some of that cavern. So this little tiny triangle of bone here really doesn't do the ethmoid bone justice. You can see it from a lateral view. I don't teach from a lateral view of the inside of the skull because it's not a model that schools commonly have. Okay, there's the sphenoid bone again, and in this view it looks much larger. There's the temporal bone, which you can see articulating with the sphenoid. We can see the left and right parietal bones that we know are really like the top sides of the skull. And the occipital bone is the back and underneath. I should say posterior and inferior curve of the skull. Take a moment to pause this slideshow and really look at this view. This picture is so foreign to students. Have you ever looked at a skull in this way? Most have not. Some have. It's important to linger on figures like this. You know the skull from the outside. Know it from the inside too. Please. There are many features on the temporal bone. The first I already mentioned is the ear hole. Sorry, that's not what it is. It's called the external acoustic meatus. Sometimes this is called the external auditory meatus. You also have an internal acoustic meatus, but you can't see that from this side of the skull, obviously. There are three processes on the temporal bone. Two are really easy to identify, and one is really confusing. If you touch behind your ear and move your jaw in a chewing motion, you can feel where your chewing muscles attach the mandible or lower jaw to the skull, and this is called the mastoid process. The word masticate means to chew, and this is where the word mastoid comes from. Whereas the mastoid process is rounded, the styloid process is pointy. The word stylus means writing utensil, like a pencil. Many times when human skulls are prepared for viewing, the styloid process easily breaks off. It's a thin little pointy thing. The zygomatic process is the third process and can be really hard to see on a lateral view of the skull. You don't get the idea of what it is. You really need to look at the skull from a superior or an inferior view, as you can see here on the right. The temporal bone is the orange bone in the picture on the right, and the process, which is called the zygomatic process, comes off the temporal bone and connects with your zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone. So the process is not named for the bone from which it originates, but it's named for the bone with which it articulates or connects. Don't worry, we'll see this again. Oh, look at that.